John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 84, and just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. In the last issue, we finished the Garth Ennis run of Hellblazer, and that ended with John finally defeating the First of the Fallen, also known as Satan or the Devil. And that was a pretty epic run, so if you didn't listen to that, definitely go back and check it out. But today we are reading issue 84, which is actually a one-shot by the original writer of Hellblazer, Jamie Delano, and I believe this is the origin of why Chas owes John. So this is like something kind of in the lore of their friendship. They've never said what it is, but apparently this issue covers why Chas feels like he's in debt to John. So first things first, with issue 84, we got the cover here. It's a very strange cover for Hellblazer. We see John Constantine is on his hands and knees on top of a beer bottle covered floor. He's looking down and he seems to be struggling. And on top of his back, almost riding John, is a chimpanzee that is dressed in a wig and is smoking and drinking and is wearing a small pink dress. And I'm assuming that this is a play on the old saying, there's a monkey on your back. And we also see on the cover, like I said, this is written by Jamie Delano with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see John is arriving at Heathrow Airport. It's a nice rainy day in London. And we see as he comes out to the pickup area that Chas is already waiting for him in his taxi. And John sees him, so he walks up to the taxi and he opens the door and says, "Hello, Chas." And immediately it seems Chas has been waiting here for a very long time, because he says to John, "What have you been bloody prating about at? Your plane landed a sod an hour ago." And as John gets in and sits down, he says, "Yeah, seems like longer. You should try getting through immigration off a charter flight from Haiti with a bloodstained passport and no luggage sometime." And as they take off driving, Chas asks, "Where's Haiti?" And John replies, "Oh, not far away, old son." And we see that the name of this issue is called In Another Part of Hell. So as they drive, John asks Chas, "You gonna flash the ash, huh? Meaning, are you gonna smoke?" And Chas replies, "Sorry, mate, giving up. You should have got some duty frees." And John replies, "Couldn't, could I? I'm skint. So can you turn that bastard meter off too?" So basically, John is saying that he doesn't have any money, and then he noticed that Chas's taxi meter was running, and he asked if he could get a free ride. Then John looks over and sees an ashtray that has a bunch of old smoked cigarettes in it, and he begins searching through it for one that has a little bit of, I guess, smoking area left. And he finds one he likes, and he pulls it out, and he says, "Ah, gold." And Chas sees this, and he's very shocked, and he says, "Struth, John, ain't you got no shame?" And as John lights his found cigarette, he says, "Needs must as the devil drives," which is a very Shakespearean way to say that it's necessary or unavoidable. So as John smokes in the back seat, he notes that Chas is kind of speeding a little bit, maybe driving kind of erratically, and he asks Chas, "Where's the fire?" And Chas replies, "Coming out of me missus' ears now, I should think. I should have been at the hospital a half hour ago. She told me to let you get the tube. I had to argue for ages." Then John leans forward and pats Chas on the shoulder and says, "You're a hero, Chas. Don't worry about Renee. I'll get her a bunch of flowers or something. Who's sick anyway?" And very dangerously, Chas turns around and looks at John and says, "No one. Our Geraldine's bringing home her baby. Amazing, isn't it? I'm a sodden granddad, John." And surprised by this information, John asks, "Your Geraldine's not that old, is she?" And Chas answers, 16 last month. And John asks, "Is the father around?" And Chas answers, "The wanker wanted her to get rid of it, so she told him to sling his bloody hook. She's going to stay home with me and the missus. We'll help her look after the kid But John cuts him off, I think because he doesn't actually care about any of this, and he says, sounds really cozy, mate. Give him all my love. Then Chas says, you'll be able to do that yourself. And a very surprised John says, what? And Chas explains, I'm dropping you off at the house while I fetch him. And immediately John is trying to get out of this situation and he says, shit, Chas. I said I wanted to go to Tottenham. But Chas isn't having it and he says, tough, no time. I'll take you later. And John begins to beg and says, come on, mate. You know I'm box office poison where Renee's concerned. And I'm crap with babies and stuff. But Chas doesn't listen and he says, stop whining. Anyway, I'd sort of like it if you saw the kid, John. Renee's got hundreds of relatives and I've only, well, I haven't, you know? And this seems to work. John reluctantly agrees, saying, all right, don't start crying. I'm getting a lump in me throat and I don't want to throw up in your cab. So Chas pulls up to his place and John gets out. And as Chas drives away back to the hospital, John says to him, I suppose it won't hurt to wet the baby's head, as long as you've got some decent gin. And as Chas drives off, he calls back, thanks, John. You're a mate. And as John walks up to the front of Chas's house, he looks at the front door and the building seems very ominous. And his narration says, I don't want to count the years since I last climbed the steps to Queenie's castle, but it must be more than 20. I was fresh down from Liverpool and stuck for a place to crash. Chas and his missus have tried to tart the old hell house up. Used to be all snot green paintwork and a scabby yard full of sodden mattresses and old ringers tangled with sooty elder trees. Place still gives me the shits, though. Some things you can't disguise with cosmetics, like death. Ever seen a corpse after the embalmer's through with it? And as John pulls out the key and he opens the front door, he looks around kind of timidly and says, give me good, honest putrefaction anytime. And as John enters Chas's residence and closes the door behind him, his narration says, for a second, that familiar sweet dread ripples my heart with excitement as I part the sickly violet lips of the door and the house exhales in my face. But the stink that slips its fingers down my throat is not the halitosis of corruption. It's thick chemical lavender. And then John says, bloody air freshener. Then he starts being nosy and looking around the house because he hasn't seen it since he was younger. So he goes around the kitchen and the living room. And as he does, his narration says, she keeps a neat house, does Renee. You'd have to be careful where you flicked your ash around here. Which reminds me. So John puts on a kettle and he begins to walk around as if he's looking for something. And his narration continues. While the kettle boils for coffee, I scout around for smokes. If I know Chas, he'll have something stashed in case of an emergency. Then John sees a china cabinet and he sees something that's kind of sticking out over the edge of the top. So he feels around up there and he does find a couple packs of cigarettes. And his narration continues. Bingo. With his dirty videos, safe out of Renee's sight. Then he lights up and his narration says, poor old Chas. She keeps him on a pretty short rope. Personally, I'd sooner top myself than live like this. But he seems to thrive on it. Bless him. Renee's a strange one. I screwed her a couple of times before she married Chas, but she never liked me. I reckon it was him she was after all along. Only she was scared of me and had to put me in my place. And as he's thinking this, he moves over to the stairs and he kind of hesitates for a second. And his narration continues saying, women can be weird. They move in mysterious ways. A smart bloke can learn a lot from them if he keeps his nerve. And Renee was right. I was a bad influence. And Chas was always in love with me. Although he'd kick you in the face if you told him so. And it seems John has already smoked the first cigarette because as he's about to walk up the stairs, he notices a potted plant and he puts his cigarette out in the dirt. And I'm assuming just leaves it there, which could also be why Renee does not like John very much. So he lights another one and he goes up the stairs. And as he hits the first landing, his narration says, it's not until I reach the first landing that it occurs to me to wonder why I'm going upstairs. I'm in a weird mood. Detached, edgy, slightly vulnerable. Fucking jet lag, I expect. And I guess on this landing, there is a room. So he looks into the room and it brings back some memories. And his narration says, this was my room for a year. Must be Chas and Renee's room now. I'm about to go in when a peripheral flicker, a transient pungency, a sense of scampering, something indefinable, attracts me to the second flight of stairs, the one that leads to the room at the top of the house, the one that Queenie used to live in, with her disgusting monkey slag. So like John said, for some reason, it's kind of unknown, he feels called to go to the second floor. And he kind of cautiously climbs up the stairs, and his back is against the wall, and he's looking up almost as if he's thinking someone's going to be up there, or as if he was trying to sneak up there without anybody hearing him. And John's narration continues. Queenie was Chaz's mom. She was a monstrous, vile, manipulative old witch. And that's the harsh but simple truth. She scared the living shit out of me. Queenie was dreadful in the oldest sense of the word. And then John says out loud, and as for her bleeding familiar. So it seems like John is being so cautious because he did hear some kind of noise. And he seems to think it might be Chaz's mom Queenie's ghost or her pet chimpanzee named Slag that might be making this noise he hears. And as John gets closer to the top of the stairs, his narration continues saying, a chitinous scratching on the skylight erects my body hair. Muscles tense momentarily. And John tries to reassure himself, so he says out loud, probably just starlings. So even though he's a little freaked out, he continues up the stairs until he gets to the room at the top. And as he pushes open the door, he sees that this room is now ready for the baby that's coming home today. So there's like a crib, and the walls are all pink with stars on them. And John's narration says, this must be Geraldine's room for now. All done up for the new kid. Shit, she's got her bed right where Queenie's used to fester. And then John says out loud, no sense, no feeling, huh, Chaz? And his narration continues saying, fancy letting your daughter and grandchild live in a room spattered with this one's psychic crud. And John says out loud, and God knows what other vile effluvium as well. So John is saying that he's picking up on all these, I guess you'd say they're psychic feelings that were left in this room from Chaz's mother and her pet chimpanzee. And as we turn the page, we get a flashback of a teenage John opening the door to this room, but now the room is puke green, and there's a mattress on the floor that's surrounded by empty alcohol bottles. And in the bed, we see Chaz's mom, who's a very large white lady, and she's just sitting in bed smoking and drinking with her chimpanzee who's wearing a wig and has a dress on. And the chimpanzee actually has its own cigarette and liquor bottle. So as teenage John looks into the room, something flies across it and hits him in the face. And our older John's narration says, the first time I ever stepped into Queenie's room, I got hit smack in the face by a handful of shit. I think it was the monkey who threw it, but I've never been completely sure. They were both laughing anyway, cackling like a brace of demons on amphetamine. Nearly stopped me bloody heart. Of course, I've seen worse since, but I was still wet behind the ears back then. So a young John goes over to the curtains in the room and he wipes the shit off his face. And as he does this, Queenie says, you must be the new lodger. Johnny, ain't it? And John answers, John. And she says back, well, wipe your mush on them curtains, Johnny, and come over here so me and Slag can have a butcher's at you. So John does that, and as he approaches her, Queenie grabs his face by the chin and moves his face around so they can look at all the sides of him. And Queenie asks the chimp, what do you reckon, girl? Pretty boy, ain't he? And then surprisingly, the chimpanzee actually answers her, saying, he's a sissy. Bet he ain't got a good shag in him. And of course, this freaks John out, so he shoots back and he says, huh? It talked. And Queenie's confused and she says, you what? And John yells back, that fucking monkey talked. But it seems like Queenie couldn't hear that because she says to John, don't be a soft twat. Slag's a monkey. If she could talk, we'd be rich and not have to rent rooms to daft turds like you. And surprisingly, John actually tries to play it cool. He pulls out a cigarette to try to compose himself, and as he lights it, he says, right, so, how come you call the monkey Slag? And Queenie answers, 'cause she is one, dopey. And with that, John is trying to leave this conversation, so he begins to walk towards the door and he says, yeah, anyway, nice chatting with you, Queenie. But as John reaches for the door, all of a sudden, the chimpanzee runs up and tries to block him from opening it. And the way this is drawn, it kind of looks like Queenie is waving her hand and the monkey's doing what she's saying. Almost like there's some sort of magical or psychic connection between them. So she yells out to John, hold your bleeding horses. Where's that little wanker of a boy of mine? And John answers, who, Chaz? He went out. Down to the pub, I think. And then Queenie gets all serious and she says, oh, did he? Slag, go and fetch the sneaky fucker back. So Slag leaves the room, and then Queenie reaches out and grabs John by the wrist and pulls him to her, saying, meantime, you'll have to do the honors, Johnny boy. Me piss pot's full, and me back teeth are afloat. And I'm not sure if she's actually bedridden or if she's just fucking with John. But we see there is like what I guess would be a chamber pot next to her bed. So she doesn't really leave this room to use the restroom. So because the chimpanzee is gone, she wants John to empty that so she can use it. But that's not all she does. She begins to pull his hand under her covers and she says, "But first, reach under me sheets and help me find me ciggies. I've lost them and I can't move me legs no more." And in this panel, it looks like John is struggling for his life to break her grip on his wrist because he's pulling back very hard as she tries to pull his hand under her covers. And he yells out, "No bloody chance, missus." But before he can do anything, she actually lets go of his wrist and then grabs him by the balls and squeezes. And she says, "You better, or I'll squash your little balls like sparrow eggs. Same as I will anytime you try to cross me or poke your beak into things that don't concern you." And then John falls down to his knees in pain, and she smiles at him and says, "Old slag mightn't think that much of you, Jack the bleeding lad, but you've got a badness in your eyes. Just so you remember, old Queenie's dealt with clever dicks like you before." Then we cut to the downstairs kitchen, and we see a young Chas standing behind John as John tries to wipe his face and clean his hair, I'm assuming from the leftover shit that's still on there. And Chas is saying, "I'm sorry, John." And John says, "Jesus Christ, Chas, you could have warned me." And Chas says, "You wouldn't have moved in if I had. And I did tell you me mum lived here as well." And I should say that John has like long hair because he's younger. So he's got, shoulder length hair. So as Chas says this, John flicks his wet hair back towards Chas, splashing him with water. And John says, "You never mentioned the sodden monkey, did you? Does it really come and fetch you out of the pub?" And then Chas sits down at the table and says, "It doesn't actually come in. It just makes the fucking awful stink of toilets hang around me till it gets so embarrassing I have to leave. Ain't you ever noticed it? It's always outside, up on a lamppost or somewhere, fiddling with its fanny." So if you're not following, apparently, whenever Chas goes out to the pub, his mom sends Slag the chimpanzee to wait outside and I guess stink the area up around it, and also, I guess, masturbate as it hangs off of lampposts until Chas gets so embarrassed that he has to go home. So of course, picturing that is kind of funny, so John begins to laugh, and a very defensive Chas says, "It's not fucking funny, John." And John replies, "No, mate, I bet it's not." And then Chas stands up and goes over to the door of the kitchen and kind of looks out like he thinks maybe someone might be listening. And he says, "I can't do nothing without Queenie finding out about it. Slags her bleeding eyes and ears. Always spying on me, buggering things up. Like, that little Greek girl from the chip shop? Well, I took her to the pictures last week, and guess what? She liked me. So we came back here, and before you know it, we're on the sofa doing it, And John, who's now sitting and smoking, sarcastically says, "I've seen pictures," but it seems like Chas is too sad to laugh at that because he continues saying, "Not this sort of shit, you ain't. I'm about 10 seconds from the vinegar stroke when I feel it land on my back." And John asks, "Feel what, mate?" And Chas answers, "Bloody slag, of course. The bleeding monkey was riding me like a cowboy, smoking a ciggy, slapping me arse, and whooping and hollering with a finger stuck up me tack hole." And of course, John begins to laugh uncontrollably at this, and Chas looks angered at John's reaction, but he continues saying, "Of course, the Greek bird had to paint me the full picture after she'd calmed down. I knew about the finger, mind you, but I thought it was hers." And at this, John covers his face with his towel to try to stop himself from laughing, but it's very obvious that that's what he's trying to do. And Chas sees this, and he gets very defensive and yells, "I'm warning you, John Constantine. I wouldn't tell this to another living soul. If you laugh at me, I'll batter you." Then we cut to John hysterically laughing, but trying to hide it with his hand. And Chas is at the table now sitting, and he's got his head in his hands like he doesn't know what to do. And John's narration says, "Of course, I did laugh hysterically, but he didn't batter me. He just opened up the sad, unwrapped turd of his life for me and laid it on my plate." And as John prepares tea for both of them, Chas begins to talk about his mother. He says, "Queenie was never the same as the other kids' mums. In their houses, it was the dads got drunk and did the thumping. My old man was this quiet little bloke, or maybe he just seemed that way next to her, 'cause she was big and noisy and strong as a bleeding horse. I don't remember him well. She killed him when I was 7. Chucked a stout bottle at him and knocked him down the bloody stairs. He laid in his bed coughing for a week before he died. Says pneumonia on his death certificate. That was 1960. Same year me big brother Terry got hanged. So it was just me and Queenie then." And John asks, "Where was the monkey?" And Chas replies, she got that a bit later. I asked her where it come from once. Then we cut to Queenie telling Chas, same place as you did, you little turd. Found her in me toilet pan after I'd done me business. Then Chas continues, once she had the blasted ape to snoop for her, she didn't even bother getting out of bed. She'd already stopped doing the abortions, but she still had a good business with charms. You know, love spells, baby-making potions, limp prick pills to keep the old man quiet, and the seances. For 30 bob a time, she'd let them gossip with dead relatives. She specialized in widows blokes who were killed in the war. So in these panels of Chas's backstory of his mom, we are seeing pretty much everything he's saying, but I just want to describe these seances because they look a little bit different than we've seen in other previous issues. Normally a seance would be, people sitting around a table and there's like candles and stuff. But in this one, it's two people that are standing in front of Queenie's bed and she's kind of looking up as her eyes are rolled back into her head. And there's like a ghost coming out of her nostrils of a male soldier. And so it seems that she actually does have some kind of magical powers because the spirit is definitely coming out of her. So after hearing this, John jokingly says, I thought they burned all the witches in the Middle Ages. And Chas replies, I wish to God they fucking had, John. She's made my life sheer bloody hell. Squatting up there for 10 years like some big cold toad, making me fetch and carry for her and keep her clean. And then John jokes again saying, you could have done a better job there, mate. And then John lights 2 cigarettes and walks over to Chas and gives him one. And Chas continues saying, and she just keeps getting fouler and madder. No one comes anymore. They're too scared now. They use her to frighten their kids. And then Chas quotes what he thinks his neighbors would be saying about his mom, saying, behave, or we'll send you up to Queenie's castle. And then Chas looks at John with desperation and says, Christ, I hate her, John. What am I going to do? She's made me a fucking slave. And John throws out an idea saying, you could put her in a home or something so she could get some proper looking after. That room could start a cholera epidemic. And then we can see the wheels starting to turn in Chas's brain as he thinks that idea over and he says, she'd kill me if I tried, or worse. Just thinking about it gives me the shits. You don't know what she can do, John. She can just look at you and fill you up with fear. And if she does the trance thing, the white stringy stuff starts wriggling out of all her holes and kind of tangles you up. And this shocks John and he says, Struth, what, like ectoplasm? And Chas replies, she calls it spirit spunk. It's horrible, mate. Then John asks, why don't you just piss off somewhere for good? And Chas replies, I tried it. She sent the monkey. It made the smell so bad, people were puking in the street. And then John gets quiet and very serious for a second, and he stares at his cigarette as it burns and smoke goes up, and he says, I suppose killing her's out of the question. And as we turn the page, we cut back to present day, where John is looking around the nursery again, and he sees a stuffed monkey in the baby's crib, and his narration says, primal terror, sexual dread, rites of passage. Back then, I never thought much about bollocks like that. An older, wiser man might have found a more subtle angle, but I was a hot-blooded, post-adolescent male. My friend was in trouble, so I just waded in. Of course, I wasn't being totally altruistic. I've been into spooky shit since I was a kid, but I'd never had a real magical enemy to try myself against before. To be honest, I was begging for it. Along with the free love and rock and roll, this was what I'd left home looking for. And under this narration in the panels, we see John picking up the stuffed monkey, giving it a quick look over, and then tossing it onto a shelf. Then John sits down onto a bed in the room, and I think I forgot to mention, but he is smoking in the baby's room. So as he lays down on the bed, his narration says, and on the bottom line, I suppose I must have known instinctively that if I freed Chas from Queenie's spell, got the monkey off his back, I'd have a friend for life. And friends are always useful. Then we cut back to the flashback of young John and young Chas. And this is after that scene in the kitchen where John suggested that they kill Chas's mom. So John's narration says, took me a month to figure it out and work up the nerve to do it. I never said a word to Chas. He didn't understand magic. It freaked him out. He just wanted a straight, simple life. And anyway, you couldn't really expect a bloke to help you doing his old mum, even if it was for his own good. And under this narration, we're just seeing the day-to-day of Chas's life, where we see him changing out his mom's chamber pots, and John is just kind of watching this from the stairs as Chas walks down them. And we also see the chimpanzee Slag is watching Chas very intently as he goes down the stairs with the waste bucket. And once Chas is in the middle of the stairs, the chimpanzee swings down and smacks the pot out of Chas's hands and sends the refuse flying. And over these panels, John's narration says, "Think how he might have turned out if I hadn't done it. They'd probably be catching him about now, with 30 bodies buried in the yard. And it wasn't that easy for me either. The basic magical principle, there's always a price. I had to get off with the bleeding monkey." And John is serious here because as we turn the page, we see John's plan seems to be to get the affection of the chimp and make it think that he is in love with it. So we see in the first couple panels that John is just acting super nice to the mom. And the narration over these panels says, "Queenie had my card marked from the start. I think she saw me as some kind of a major upstart. She knew I was trouble, but thought she could easily slap me arse. I was Jack the lad, though. I played it cool, ignored the insults, made jokes with her, and never let on that I was shit scared the way Chas did. And that really got on her tits, made her desperate to find a weakness, so she let slag loose on me. The monkey was Queenie's familiar, her agent. It was part of her. Symbiotic was a word I'd just learned. It seemed to fit. It seems insanely arrogant now, but magic's such a squirmy, seductive thing, and it always has its own kind of mad, subjective logic. And the way I saw it, without the monkey for support, the old cow wouldn't have a leg to stand on, so to speak." So under this narration, we're seeing that John is playing the game. Like he said, he was basically killing the mom with kindness, which made her get suspicious and try to find some way to get at John. So she sent the chimpanzee to spy on him. So as the chimpanzee is looking at John through the window of his bedroom, John knows he's being watched. So he literally just strips naked in front of the window, giving the chimpanzee a full view of his naked body. And like he said, this is actually Queenie's familiar. So it's basically her looking at him naked. And in the panel where John turns around and gives the chimpanzee a full look at his front, the chimpanzee has a very excited look on its face. And then John goes over to the window and pretends that he doesn't see the chimpanzee, and he shuts the curtains. But we can see that once they're closed, John knew that the chimpanzee was there, and he gives a very evil smile as if to say that all is going according to plan. And that seems to be just the start of it, because as we turn the page, we see the chimp is now hanging around John at all times of the day. We see John shaving, then we see John making breakfast. And over these panels, the narration says, "I hated that ape worse than poison. It had a tongue that was pure bloody evil. It was always hanging around me, whispering shit from just out of range. Twisted sex stuff mostly. Stuff to make you generally sick or furious or suddenly want to cry. But I didn't do none of that. I listened, smiled politely, and stayed calm. After a couple weeks, I started to pay it the odd compliment, to flirt with it, but it never come within reach. Old Slag didn't trust me. She was a wise monkey. I pushed it a bit, went all wan and moody, feigned infatuation. Christ, I should have got a bloody Oscar. Chas thought I'd gone bloody nuts." So in these panels, we're seeing John on his hands and knees giving the chimpanzee a flower. We're seeing even when the chimpanzee isn't in the room or near him, he's like still pretending just in case. So we see Chas is looking at John very worried as John writes with his finger on a window, "I love Slag." Then we see John giving the ape more presents and also like pretending to cry in his bed at night because he knows the chimp is watching him most of the time. And the narration over these panels says, "I groveled for attention. I bought her gifts, cigarettes, stockings. She wore them for me too, God help me, but still wouldn't let me touch her. So I made myself sob in the night while she sat outside giggling, getting off on my misery. But then one night I didn't go back to the house. I walked to the canal and waited. It took her 2 hours to find me, but I knew I had her then." So we turn the page and we see young John is sitting outside by the canal, and we see the chimpanzee arrive and he sees her and he stands up and he says, "You're so beautiful. I'm in love with you. I can't live if you despise me. I'll have to drown myself." So John leans forward as if he's going to throw himself into the water, and the chimp runs down and tries to stop him. And John's narration says, "I tell you, my heart was in my mouth. She might have called my bluff, but cliches are sometimes deadly. She bought it, sort of smiled and let her guard down." So we see the chimp grab onto John's coat to stop him from falling, and as he turns around to look at her, We see she's smiling at John in a very flirty way. And that's what John was waiting for. She is close enough now that John lunges for her and grabs her by the neck and holds her under the water. And we can see that even though John is drowning the chimpanzee, in the water, there's some ripples that form the shape of Queenie's face. And as John struggles to keep the chimpanzee under the water, his narration says, "She was putty in my hands, and I squeezed the rank power from her, inhaling it in the bursting bubbles of her drowning breath, feeling snake ropes of ectoplasm writhing around me. I knew it was black murder I was doing, that Queenie would be dead before I got back home, but holding on, even though the blood howled in my ears, and a mocking voice called from far away." Then John's story is interrupted by the present day as someone says, "Ooh, look, Mom, there's a strange man in me bed." Then John, who was recalling all this with his eyes closed on the bed, opens them and he sees the shadow of a woman that kind of is in the shape of Chaz's mom. And John says out loud, "Queenie?" But then as his vision clears, he sees, no, it's not Queenie, it's a much younger woman. And she says to John, "Who? No, it's me, Geraldine. Don't you remember me, Uncle John?" Then John sits up and he sees Chas holding the baby and Chaz's wife Renee standing in the doorway. And also, it seems John has dropped his cigarette on the floor and it started to burn the carpet. And Renee sees this and says, "Look at that! I knew it! The bastard's only gone and burned a ruddy great hole in the new carpet." And John says, "Shit, sorry, Renee." But then he just lights another cigarette and Chas looks at him and says, "Looks like you blew it, John. What you kipping up here for anyway?" And John replies, "Narcoleptic episode. Always handy for ducking out of situations of moral stress, you know?" And Chas doesn't understand and he says, "Not really, mate." And John replies, "Oh well, c'est la guerre." And then he looks over at the baby and says, "This the new Sprague then?" And Chas smiles at him and says, "Yeah, ain't she bloody gorgeous?" And John smiles and says, "Pretty as a picture, just like her grandma." And then he looks over at Renee and smiles at her, and she looks at Chas and says, "He's not staying." But no one really pays attention to her. We just see Geraldine looking at her baby and smiling, and she says, "Do you really think she's pretty? It's weird. After I'd had her and the nurse gave her to me to hold, I looked down expecting to see something like Jesus lying there. But I just thought, bugger me, what an ugly little sod. Looks like a shriveled up old monkey. Here, you can hold her if you want." And as Geraldine says this, we can already see John is slowly moving towards the door of the room. And he says to her, "Better not. I've got one of me own already, love. And it might just get jealous." And Geraldine, of course, is confused because she doesn't understand what John's talking about because he's referencing what she said about a monkey. But of course, she doesn't know any of the stuff we just learned about Slag and Queenie. And of course, John doesn't really go into any of that. So he just turns to leave and says, "Look, I don't want to be rude, but I'm going to piss off. Happy family stuff just brings out the worst in me." And then he looks over at Chas and says, "That was part of the deal, Chas. I got my own monkey to haul around, remember?" And of course, Chas knows what John's talking about, but no one else does. And Chas immediately says, "Right, I'll drive you, mate. Where'd you want to go?" And Renee is not happy about this, so she says very disapprovingly, "Chas!" But John kind of saves him and puts his hand on Chaz's shoulder and says, "Nah, it's all right. I could do with a stroll. Just do us one small favor, huh?" And Chas smiles at John and says, "Anything, John. You know you only ever have to ask." And John looks over at the baby and says, "Don't let them call the kid Queenie, right?" And you can imagine there's probably like a wink and a nod between Chas and John there. But we're seeing the back of them, so we can't really tell. But that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.